We will now take a look at WSA from a high-level perspective. This is going to be an introduction to the appliance. A Cisco WSA, or just Web Security Appliance, is acting as an advanced web content filtering solution. And there are going to be three main reasons why you would want to use WSA in your network. One is going to be to provide super fast web proxy services to your clients, which eventually will allow you to increase the security of the deployment of the network simply by having the ability of controlling the web communication, web and FTP communication, traversing via the WSA. Of course, all communication that you will proxy through the appliance, you will have full control over what type of connections you would want to allow versus what you would block. You will also have control over the content that you will want to permit. There are going to be a lot of different elements that you will be able to enforce for your policies. Plus, you will also have the ability of scanning the content, scanning your transactions, looking for signs of malware or maybe spyware programs. In terms of the actual functionality offered by the appliance, individual features and engines that you may activate, it is going to be first and foremost the ability of controlling communication transaction based on their URLs. And same as with FTD, you will not only be able to refer to individual URLs, but you will be also able to deploy your policy, configure your policy based on URL categories. So a concept of a category is used to group transactions that share some common criteria. Like, for example, packets sent to CNN.com and BBC.com, they will fall under the category of news. Versus Facebook, Twitter, it's going to be part of social networking. So instead of building your policies, based on those individual URLs, like one entry for Facebook, one for Twitter, you can use a category as a whole, and this way simplify the policy config. There's also going to be this application visibility and control, ABC, what's used to look deeper into the application. This engine will allow you to distinguish between a type of micro application used within a session. Like maybe you want to allow people to post messages on Facebook, but you don't want them to be able to play Facebook games or maybe upload images. So application visibility and control will give you that option. WSA might be able to detect the actual content within the application flow. File control and advanced malware protection, stuff like that. This is very similar to FTD's file policies. We can inspect transactions looking for certain file types, and we can use advanced malware protection to scan files, to scan content of a session looking for malware. WSA actually also supports some additional antivirus engines that are local on the appliance, like McAfee or Sophos. So those engines, you will be also able to use them to scan the content locally. HTTPS decryption is also part of the WSA's functionality. We might use this one to decrypt the flow, and this way enforce our policy based on the content of those encrypted messages. There are also some other less important engines. We will take a look at most of these, but I'm not going to discuss every single option that is available and supported by those engines one by one. What I will show you instead is going to be how to find the information about the WSA features and configuration syntax in the documentation. We will go to security and we will look for WSA at the bottom, like WSA Web Security Virtual Appliance. Let's try to open this document. Okay, this one only has one end user guide. Let's go back and let's go for Web Security Appliance. So this is where you want to go to get access to the WSA documentation. And in this case, we don't have any configuration guides. We still have some examples and tech notes, but the actual config guide is here under end user guides. I'm going to open that one. And let's go for 10.1, for example. So the document is not really super long. It's 500 pages. And you will have this table of content at the beginning here. It is going to tell you how to initialize the proxy. It will describe those elements that you will find in the GUI. It will tell you what they mean and how to enable, disable them. And it will also explain you how to deal with individual policies or just engines available on the WSA. Like, for example, if you want to perform decryption, let's take a look at section chapter 11. It says create decryption policies to control HTTPS traffic. So it is going to tell you about the prerequisites. It will explain the policy actions. It is going to show you how the flow, how packets are eventually processed when the feature is on, what do you have to do to enable it, and what those individual options that you have in the GUI actually mean. So most of those engines we will actually look at. We will see how they work. But again, I will not be discussing every single option or just field you can check in the GUI. Stuff like that you can look up in this document. Now a couple words about the versions of WSA, the WSA platforms. So as with most of the new Cisco security appliances, we can do a physical or virtual WSA. In case of physical appliances, we've got 3 series: S100, S300, and S600 is series appliances, where 600 is deemed for the largest enterprises. Now the difference between those series is all about the amount of disk space and memory and CPU cores. And it's going to be actually the same with virtual appliances. The differences between the different types of VM of images, because it's not only VMware where you can run WSA, you can also host WSA on Linux systems. You can also use UCS. Essentially the S100, this is going to be an equivalent of those physical appliances. 300 is going to be for medium offices, and finally 600 is going to be for the largest enterprises. The same as with physical stuff, the difference is going to be in those 3 parameters. Now the S000V image, this is what you would only use for testing, for evaluation purposes. And maybe let me quickly show you this. We will look for Cisco WSA datasheet. Let's take a look at the actual numbers for maybe first for the physical appliances. Like S170, this is the low-end appliance. The power consumption, the CPU, 1 dual core, 4 gigs of RAM. Versus the other end of the spectrum, 690, it says 2 E5 2680 V3 processors. It says 8 cubes total, where each of the cubes has 8 gigs of RAM. And then we also see the differences in the hard disk size. RAID 1, 250 gigs for S170 versus 8 600 gigs drives for S690. And then down to virtual appliances, this is the lowest end of the spectrum, 6 gigs of RAM, 2 cores, where for 600 virtual, we will have 24 gigs of memory and 12 CPU cores. Of course, which of these you will eventually select for the deployment is going to depend on the amount of users and the amount of traffic that you anticipate to have in the network. Then one more thing before we finish, just a quick overview of the interfaces of the WSA, because this is what we will have to know to properly initialize the proxy. WSA interfaces are broken down into 2 types. We've got data ports for the proxy, or for a so-called layer 4 traffic monitor feature. Now L4TM, we will talk about this stuff in one of the other sessions because this is actually an optional component and it's not really extensively used in real production deployments. But the proxy, web proxy ports, this is what you will focus on the most. And now the only difference between whether you want to use one or two of them is going to be in the amount of traffic that is going to be flowing for the WSA. Because you can go for just one of them for P1, in which case you will use it for inbound and outbound communication. Versus when you go for two ports, you'll have to put one interface, like P2, towards the internet, and then P1, you would put it towards your clients. So one is going to be used for inbound, and the other one is going to be used for outbound communication, as opposed to using just one port, which is for both directions. And the same concept applies to L4TM interfaces. It's just the meaning that is going to be different here, because L4TM is generally used for ideas like functions, not for the proxy inspection. And then for administration, there's going to be just one interface that we will use to access a WSA to configure it. It is going to be the management port M1. We can connect using HTTP, HTTPS, or SSH. One important thing to remember about that one is that in the simplest deployment, it is going to be possible to use a single interface for both the data and management plane. So normally what you would do is that you would put your M1 to the management network, and then you would use P1 or maybe P1 and P2 for the data plane. This is how you would normally deploy the WSA. But for the smallest networks, what you can do is you can go for just one interface. You could stick to the management port, where you would use it for administration and you would use it for the data plane. So this option definitely simplifies the deployment, but is not recommended due to decreased security, decreased overall security of the solution, and also lower amount of traffic that the appliance will be able to inspect.